Open our Bibles to the book of Numbers, chapter 3, and we'll read about the third division of the Levites who assisted the priests under the Old Testament system. Beginning at verse 33, we read about the Merarites. There we read, of Merari was the family of the Malites and the family of the Mushites. These are the families of Merari. Those who were numbered of them, according to the number of all the males from a month old and over, were 6,200. The prince of the father's house of the families of Merari was Zuriel, the son of Abihail. They shall camp on the north side of the tabernacle. The appointed duties of the sons of Merari shall be the tabernacle's boards, its bars, its pillars, its sockets, all its instruments, all its service, the pillars of the court around it, their sockets, their pins, and their cords. So I've said that we learn from the Merarites the greatness of serving, that is, serving others and serving one another, because, as you may have noticed, as we read the duties of the Merarites, the items that they were to take care of were all the heaviest items, the really heavy ones. And this suggests then doing the hard work that wouldn't be the choice of anyone who had a choice what he would do, but it was service. The idea of service is usually understood as something that an inferior does for a superior, and being treated like a servant is understood to mean being humiliated and required to do something that is not sought or desired. And it's often spoken of with an overtone of bondage or of something degrading. So it's the last thing that the person would want to do if he's hoping to get up in the present world. Rather, he would want others to serve him. And yet Christ put the values exactly the other way around. And listen to these verses that we read in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 20. Christ said, "You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. Whoever desires to be first among you shall be your bondservant, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And again, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, the Lord said, chapter 22, "Who is greater, one who sits at the table or one who serves? Isn't it he who sits at the table? But I am among you like one who serves." So Christ completely reversed the values of the natural human mind. And this is what is taught by the Merarites, because they did the heaviest work in moving the tabernacle. They moved the heaviest objects. And as we'll see, their work was necessary to make the work of the other divisions possible. So they were serving the other two divisions. In an ordinary human society, it wouldn't be surprising if those who have the heavier duties, the hard work, would resent it, because, it's a hard thing to do. But since what the Merarites were doing was for God and for God's people, it was to be looked on rather as a great work, a work that would be a privilege to do. And accepting to serve God and others is a way commonly looked on as inferior and degrading, but it is a way of following the example of Christ in humility, and humility is a virtue. So the Christian who takes to heart the service expected of him and the greatness of serving one another, he'll realize the lowliness of the service. And Christ actually taught that the lowlier the service in natural human estimation, the greater the one performing it is in God's sight. The name Merari means bitter or sorrowful. And in antiquity, usually if a person was given a name like that, a name that carried any thought of sorrow or of something unpleasant, he was given such a name because his mother had had an extra hard time giving birth to him. So that's a picture of something really unpleasant and hard to go through. But God had arranged in his sovereignty that the ancestor of this division of the Levites would be given a name like that because that division would be doing service that would often be very exacting and seem burdensome and even seem perhaps like drudgery. Yes, we mentioned earlier that the Kohathites camped, when Israel set up camp, the Kohathites camped on the south side, but here we find the Merarites camping on the north side. And again, as we said, in the Middle Eastern world, when one is giving directions to another, he always gives the directions assuming that the person is facing east. So therefore, that would mean that the Merarites were camped on the north side of the tabernacle. And the left side, in Oriental thinking, or the left hand of a person, or the sitting to his left side, it's always a side of lowliness and of inferiority. Sometimes it's even the side of cursing to be on somebody's left side. And it's possible that the Merarites were given that position because Merari was the youngest of the three brothers in the family.
We lost you, John.
That's really frozen. Anything we could do from this end?
I don't.
Hopefully you're voting. I mean, you're connecting.
Okay, back again. Don't know what happened, but anyway, we'll persevere. Yes, so so Merari was the youngest of three brothers in the family, and the youngest was often given the chores that were less desired. So maybe that's why this division of the Levites had the hardest work to do in moving the tabernacle from one place to another. Now, sometimes God reversed that custom, that the youngest in the family had the lowliest position, and he did that in giving the position that doubtless would have been considered the most privileged to the Kohathites, even though Kohath was the second oldest in the family. It was Gershon who was the oldest, but Kohath was given the most privileged position. But God did not reverse that custom for the Merarites because Merari was the youngest and he had the hardest physical work to do. And there's no explanation given to that, telling us that we must accept the place that God chooses to give us, and doubtless with a good reason. So the duties of the Merarites teach us to be willing to do service with which man associates no honor, and he even tends to look down on it. So, as we said, the Merarites had the hardest work because they transported the heaviest objects. One thing they transported was the sockets to hold the pillars that made the fence around the tabernacle court. The sockets were sort of blocks of silver that had a slot in the top, and a board would fit into that slot. So it held the board standing on end. And that board served as a pillar on which the fine linen curtains were hung. But silver is a very heavy metal, and it would have taken a good heavy piece of silver to hold the pillar upright, even if there was a storm blowing against the fence. So it was a heavy item. And then the boards that formed the tabernacle itself, they were made of wood, but they were overlaid with gold, and gold is even heavier than silver. Now you might be wondering, well, what about the items inside the tabernacle? The ark and the incense altar and the table of showbread were all made of wood, but overlaid with gold. Yes, they were, but they weren't all that big. Many Christians have an exaggerated notion of how big those furnishings were. But a socket that would hold a pillar upright in the outer fence, it would be really heavy. And the sockets of the, rather silver was what held the boards of the tabernacle itself. And then the pillars of the outer fence, they were made of bronze, which also was quite heavy. And the yes, so all those items would be heavy to carry. And on top of the heaviness of the items that the Merarites had to transport, there was the tightness of the cords that they had to fasten to also hold the pillars upright. Now, certainly the tabernacle itself also had cords that had to be tightened to hold the boards of the tabernacle itself upright. But the cords of the outer fence would have had to be tighter because the outer fence would serve like a windbreak for the tabernacle itself. So that means the Merarites would have had to tighten their cords tighter than how the Gershonites had to tighten their cords. And the harder you tighten the cords, the more muscle it takes, the heavier the job it is. So the Merarites had to pull harder than to fasten their cords. We often hear a complaint among people when the tasks are being assigned to them. Why do I have to do the hard part? Or why do I have to do the hardest part? That's our natural reaction. But if it's for the Lord, then let us do it joyfully. And when Merari is mentioned, that division is always mentioned together with the other divisions of the Levites. The Kohathites and the Gershonites are sometimes mentioned alone, just the one division by itself. But the Merarites are always mentioned together with at least one of the other divisions, which suggests that their work was less prominent, perhaps less noticed by other people. And the saint who aspires to be specially great must not seek prominence in his service or to be in the limelight. He must accept to do what's behind the scenes. Furthermore, the Merarites required grace in order to live largely among people who had made a poor spiritual choice. Because you might remember that God ordered that every tribe of Israel was to give some of its cities to the Levites, because the Levites owned no property of their own, so they're to be given cities among other tribes. Well, of the cities that were given to the Merarites, the vast majority were on the east side of the Jordan River, and each of the three divisions of the Levites was given 2 cities of refuge where somebody who had killed a person accidentally could flee, so they wouldn't be put to death as a murderer. Well, each of those 3 divisions was given 2 cities of refuge, but the Merarites, both cities of refuge that they were given were on the east side of Jordan. Now, was there anything wrong with being on the east side? Well, remember, at a time when Moses was still alive and still leading the people, Israel was still on the east side of the Jordan. And when they had conquered the territory of the Ammonites, then 2.5 tribes came to Moses and said, could we have our inheritance on this side of the Jordan? So don't bring us over the Jordan. This is a good land for our cattle, so we'd like to have our inheritance here. And God told Moses that he would permit that, but it was not the best choice because that was not the promised land proper. It was the territory on the east side of the Jordan was land that God wanted to give to Israel as colonies that they would rule over as an empire. But the land that he wanted to be their own country was on the west side of the Jordan. Remember also that God told Moses that because of one sin he committed, he wouldn't be allowed to go into the promised land. But Moses did enter the land that was chosen by those 2.5 tribes, but he didn't cross the Jordan to the west side, where he would have been in the promised land proper. So these 2.5 tribes who settled on the east side of the Jordan, they were making a choice of what we could call the good rather than the best. It wasn't a bad choice because they weren't asking to return to Egypt like some Jews had asked. It was territory that God wanted to give them, but it wasn't the best choice because it wasn't the promised land proper. And the Merarites, most of them had to live among those Jews on the east side of the Jordan who had made a less than the best choice. That's something that Christians quite often have to face. We have different choices that we could make, and there's one choice that we couldn't say would be bad, but yet it wouldn't be the best choice that we could make. Do we always want God's best? Well, the Merarites had to live largely among people who had made a less than the best choice. And that must have taken grace for them. But they were required to serve those tribes patiently and gently. And if we're required of God to serve fellow believers who have made poor choices, we might find it disheartening. We might feel frustrated by their lack of spiritual aspiration. But God would have it that we all the same serve them patiently and seek to encourage them to the best that is still possible. Christ showed a very lowly degree of service that we must be willing to perform when he represented it by foot washing. In the upper class households in Israel, washing the feet of guests was usually the job of the lowliest of the slaves. But Christ did that for his disciples, and he said we should be willing to do service of that caliber for one another. Did you ever hear of John Wanamaker? He was a famous Christian merchant. One time he paid a visit to Christians in China, when China was still a free country, and he saw an aged man who was plowing a field with a primitive kind of plow, and the plow was being pulled by an ox and a young man who was the old man's son. And Mr. Wanamaker was able evidently to communicate with the Chinese. He asked, how come you're doing it that way? How come you don't have an animal? How come you don't have 2 animals pulling the plow? And the old man told him, it's because we're Christians. And at one time we learned that some Christians were in great need. So we sold the other ox that we had in order to provide the need of fellow Christians. And my son is taking its place and he's doing the pulling. Well, that was quite a sacrifice for that family to make. And Wanamaker said his reaction was to pray, Lord, let me be hitched to a plow so that I may know the joy of sacrificial devotion. The Christian who takes to heart the service expected of him and service toward one another, he is mindful of the lowliness of the service, but he's also mindful of the resources for the service to enable him to perform such arduous service. Yes, God does expect us to perform lowly service, but he doesn't leave us ill-equipped for it, as though he forgot about us. And the equipment that God provided for the Merarites was that they had twice as many wagons as the Gershonites had, because their equipment was heavier. God had decreed in the passage about the Gershonites that they were to have 2 wagons and 4 oxen, but the Merarites had 4 wagons and 8 oxen, with the 2 oxen pulling each wagon, because what they transported was so heavy. Now, those wagons were first used in bringing offerings for the dedication of the altar, the bronze altar on which sacrifices were offered. But then after that, they kept the wagons for the transportation of the tabernacle. And that shows us that God always provides adequate equipment for whatever he calls us to do. And even though he hadn't allowed the Kohathites to have any wagons, he allowed them to the Gershonites and the Merarites, and that was his sovereign choice. But we can be assured that each division of the Levites had adequate equipment. And if he allows us to use equipment that is associated particularly with this present world, he'll give us the needed grace to avoid letting our hearts become attached to earthly items. And that assures us that he'll never allow us to be tried beyond what we're able to bear. But here's something impressive, is that even though the Merarites were the smallest of the 3 divisions of the Levites, they had the smallest population, and yet during the 2 years on the way from Egypt to Kadesh Barnea, and those 2 years would have been the entire journey if Israel had not rebelled at Kadesh Barnea. Well, during that 2 years that God would have wanted to be their entire journey, during that time, the Merarites had more men of age for service in the priesthood than the other 2 divisions had. They had the smallest population, and yet during those 2 years, they had the most men of age for service in the priesthood. Sounds somewhat mysterious, but men served in the priesthood, men who were priests or Levites. They began their service at the age of 30, and then they ended it at the age of 50. And Merari had the most men of that age during those 2 years, which seems that God gave them a special increase of men at the age for serving in the priesthood or serving the priests at the very time when they would need it most, because he had compassion on them for the heaviness of their service. Once they were in the promised land and the tabernacle would no longer be getting moved from place to place, they wouldn't have such heavy duties. But during those 2 years that God wanted to be the entirety of their journey, without the 40 years that were added because of their rebellion, during those 2 years, they had an extra great number of men to do that moving. And it shows that God has control over the number of his servants doing a given duty, and he assures that they have enough personnel so they won't be overburdened. It also shows us the particularly critical need for those who are willing to do work that's behind the scenes, because the Merarites' work was service that was likely to be mainly behind the scenes and not so much noticed. It's like the service that the apostles called serving tables in Acts chapter 6. but there's especially critical those who are willing to do such kind of service and who are willing to follow rather than to lead. There's a story told of a man who passed by a group of little boys, and it intrigued him that that group of little boys were so quiet. He thought, that's not how boys usually play. They're usually boisterous and lively. And so the man asked those little boys, why are you so quiet? And the boy's answer was, we're playing war, but we're all generals and we can't get anyone to do the fighting. Well, that was a juvenile example of too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And that's a situation that can easily develop in the church, in assembly contexts. We need followers as well as leaders. But the Merarites had assurance of God's enabling for their task, because the name of their leader was, in verse 35, their leader's name was Zuriel, which means God is my rock. He would provide a strong foundation for them for doing their work. Or it could alternatively be translated, God is my strength, because the word rock was often used in Hebrew to mean strength, because a rock is strong. And with all the weight that they had to bear, they were assured of not sinking or collapsing, because God would hold them up and give them the strength for it. And even though God had given the Merarites extra wagons and extra men of the age for serving and extra oxen, yet ultimately their strength came from God. And whatever God may equip us to do for service that is arduous, our strength ultimately comes from Him. He's the one who will enable us to do it. And the Merarites did eventually get some relief when they entered the promised land. They had no human help from outside their division during their journey through the desert, but God, in His sovereignty again and by His providence, He arranged that they would have help by and by. Because, and of all things, because God will use both the good and the bad actions of men to get His purposes served, that doesn't make Him the author of the bad things, but it shows He can make use of them, cause all things to work for good to those who love Him. And by and by, the Merarites got help because of a blunder made by Israel's leaders. Remember about the Gibeonites who came to Joshua and his colleagues and deceived them, making them think they were from a faraway country, and said, can we make an alliance with you? Promise you won't kill us? And then a few days later, after they'd made that alliance, they discovered that they'd been tricked. And they said, well, we can't kill the Gibeonites now that we've promised not to. But what did they say the Gibeonites would do? They would chop wood and draw water for the house of God. Now, who do you think was doing that job before they met the Gibeonites? Those were jobs that the Merarites would have been doing because they were the heavy work. But now, from now on, they'll have the Gibeonites to help them. God provided relief for them, moving in a mysterious way so that their work wouldn't be too arduous for them. The Christian who takes to heart the service expected of him realizes the lowliness of the service, but he also values the resources for his service, and he cares about the usefulness of his service. And the service of the Merarites was what would give the structure and the protection to the tabernacle and its property, because what they transported would hold up the curtains that the Gershonites transported, and it would provide shelter for the sacred furniture that the Kohathites transported. And when believers are all involved together in serving God, well then, that's a healthy spiritual condition for the local assembly to be in. And it's what is pictured, I believe, by the reference in Ephesians to the whole building being fitly joined together, an allusion to how the boards of the tabernacle that stood on end in sockets were held together by the horizontal bars that bound them together. That's a picture of the church as the body of Christ and the members joined together in service. And the work of the Merarites made the work of the other divisions possible. Because if it weren't for the Merarites, then the other divisions would have no place to put the items they transported when they arrived at a place for camping. And when Israel was on the move, then the Merarites and the Gershonites would have worked together to facilitate the work of the Kohathites, because each tribe of Israel had its particular place to camp around the tabernacle. 3 tribes of Israel on each of the 4 sides, and then each of the 3 divisions of the Levites camped on one side, with the priests camping on the east side. And there was a specific order in which they were to begin moving whenever they did move on to a new place. And between, the Gershonites and the Merarites would leave together, and then there were 3 tribes that were to follow after them. And since the total population of Israel, we said Thursday, was probably close to 3 million, that would mean that a quarter of the nation would be roughly 750,000 people. All those people would be between the Gershonites and Merarites together and the Kohathites. Now just imagine 750,000 people all traveling. It would take time for that many people to arrive at the next stop. And that gave the Gershonites and the Merarites time to set up the items they brought, so that when the Kohathites arrived, the tabernacle would already be all set up and they'd be all ready to put the furniture in it. They didn't have to wait for the Gershonites and the Merarites to do their job. It had already been done by the time the Kohathites got there, because of the time that it would take for a quarter of the total population of Israel to arrive in between. So God had the timing all figured out and all set up. And that's a beautiful picture of saints with one function working to make the function of other saints possible, because there's cooperation in serving one another. Those who perform lowly service that involves hard work are often not very highly esteemed in the natural human mind. But Christ said, that which is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. His values are quite different from ours. And it's also he who said, whoever desires to be first among you shall be your bondservant, because the way to be truly great is to be the servant of all, or as we sometimes say it, the way up is down, because by humbling ourselves to serve one another, that's the way to go up, to be really great. The Christian who takes to heart the service expected of him realizes the lowliness of the service, but he also values the resources provided for the service, and he cares about the usefulness of the service. It's claimed that in colonial days, it was necessary for a certain sector of the colonial American army to throw a bag of supplies over an 8-foot wall. And so the men had to heave that bag hard enough to get it over that wall. And the general under whom they were, he said, all right, boys, come on. 1, 2, 3, up. And the men heaved with all their might, and they almost got the bag over the wall, but not quite. Didn't quite make it. Said, come on, boys, you've got to heave harder. You've got to put more muscle into that. Come on, 1, 2, 3, up. And they tried again and failed. But the general kept on insisting and showed no compassion. And his men were eventually getting to feel exhausted because they tried so many times and not made it. But no compassion. And then by and by along came a stranger who was wearing a plain overcoat. And without saying a word, he ran in and joined the men in that division of the army. And with his added strength, they got that bag of supplies over the wall. And then that stranger went and faced the general, and he said, "Sir, don't you think you could have given your men a hand getting that bag of supplies over the wall? Because if you would help them, they could have gotten that bag over the wall the very first time." And the general flew into a rage and said, "Who do you think you are, talking to a general that way?" And the stranger just smiled and unbuttoned his overcoat until before long, the general recognized that under that plain overcoat, he was wearing the uniform of an officer who was far superior to a general. So now the general realized he could be in serious trouble for talking back to a superior. But all that superior officer said was, "Friend, the way to be truly great is to become the servant of all." And who do you suppose that superior officer who had disguised himself as a stranger was? Well, it's claimed that he was none other than George Washington, who later became the first president. And that's a picture of lowly service and humbling oneself in order to serve others and to take Christ's example, who, being the King of glory, took a servant's place and gave us a demonstration of the greatness of service, that the way to be truly great is to be the servant of all. And our most worthy Lord, who gave us this supreme example of service in thy beloved Son, he who was the King of glory, but who humbled himself and took on the form of a servant, and who gave us such an example. Oh Lord, we ask for the grace to follow his example. Teach us the value of serving one another and often doing things that aren't noticed and that might even be the hard part in what needs to be done. And not to be upset if we feel unappreciated, but to realize that we are doing what we do ultimately for our Lord, who is worthy of all service. Blessed be his name, who humbled himself and came not to be served, but to serve and to give himself as a ransom for many. He is worthy of all, and we pray